The engines thundered like rolling drums across the frozen expanse of the European sky. High above the clouds, in neat but vulnerable formations, hundreds of American B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 liberators pressed forward into the heart of Nazi Germany. Their silver wings gleamed in the winter sun of 1943, contrails stretching behind them like scars across the heavens. For the men inside, each mission was a gamble with death. Below, German radar stations tracked their progress, and Luftwaffe squadrons scrambled to meet them. The German fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s, were sleek, deadly predators. Waiting in clouds or swooping from the sun, they dove mercilessly upon the bomber streams. For Luftwaffe aces, these missions were hunting grounds. They had grown used to the helplessness of American formations. Once past the range of Allied Spitfires and Thunderbolts, the bombers were alone, lumbering targets over hostile territory. The Luftwaffe laughed at the notion that such machines could break Germany's war industry without proper escorts. Inside the bombers, the picture was far grimmer. Crews braced themselves behind machine guns, their eyes scanning the skies. The cold seeped through the fuselage, freezing hands to metal grips. Oxygen masks frosted with each breath. Men huddled in what many grimly called flying coffins, praying to survive the gauntlet of German defenses. A gunner later recalled how entire planes seemed to disintegrate in midair when enemy cannon shells found their mark. Bomb bays exploding into fire, wings shearing off, men spilling into the void. The missions to targets like Schweinfurt and Regensburg etched themselves into memory. In August 1943, when American bombers struck Schweinfurt's ball-bearing factories, the price was staggering. 60 bombers lost in a single day, over 600 men killed or captured. Luftwaffe propaganda seized upon the spectacle, showing German civilians that their skies were defended by brave pilots who could cut through the Allied fleets like knives through cloth. For the Americans, the reality was crushing. At these loss rates, daylight bombing seemed unsustainable. Yet the stakes demanded persistence. The U.S. Army Air Forces clung to the doctrine of precision bombing, believing they could cripple Germany's war machine by striking its factories, refineries, and transport hubs. To abandon the campaign was unthinkable. Generals like Ira Eaker and Karl Spaatz argued that without destroying German industry, the war could drag on indefinitely. Every mission became a desperate gamble, fought with the knowledge that victory might be paid for in blood and steel. The Luftwaffe's confidence soared. For pilots like Erich Hartmann and Gunther Rahl, who carved their reputations from these deadly encounters, American bombers seemed like little more than sacrificial lambs. German aces scoffed at the idea that the United States could challenge their dominance. With battle-tested tactics and superior aircraft, they believed they would always rule the skies. But even amid this peril, hints of change were emerging. Whispers circulated in Luftwaffe briefings of a new American fighter, long-ranged and fast, though many dismissed it as Allied propaganda. The Americans, however, knew the truth. Without a revolutionary solution, their strategy of striking Germany in daylight would collapse entirely. The chapter closes with one haunting image: smoke trails spiraling downward, shattered bombers falling from the sky as German fighters returned triumphantly to their bases. For now, the Reich still owned the air above its heartland. But in the shadow of these losses, an aircraft once overlooked and even ridiculed, the P-51 Mustang, was preparing to make its entrance. It would soon transform desperation into dominance, and the hunters would learn what it meant to be hunted. In 1940, as Britain stood alone against Hitler's war machine, the Royal Air Force found itself in desperate need of new aircraft. Its aging fleet could not withstand years of attrition, and British officials sought help from across the Atlantic. They approached North American Aviation, a relatively small American manufacturer, with a request: build a new fighter, quickly. What emerged from the drafting tables in Inglewood, California, was sleek and modern. Engineers under Edgar Schmid designed a revolutionary airframe with a laminar flow wing, reducing drag and promising higher speeds. The prototype, named the P-51 Mustang, first flew in October 1940, an aircraft born not from U.S. Army requirements, but from a British plea for survival. At first, however, the Mustang was a disappointment. Fitted with the Allison V1710 engine, it excelled at low altitudes but lacked performance at high altitudes, where most of the air war over Europe was being fought. Luftwaffe pilots who encountered the early models in 1942 dismissed them as little threat. Compared to the Spitfire's agility or the Messerschmitt Bf 109's climb rate, the Mustang seemed ordinary. For a time, it appeared destined to remain in obscurity, relegated to reconnaissance and ground attack duties. Yet buried in its design was untapped potential. Its wing structure and fuselage promised greater capability, if only the engine could match the airframe's promise. The turning point came when British engineers, frustrated by the Allison's shortcomings, proposed fitting the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that had made the Spitfire and Hurricane legends of the Battle of Britain. The results were transformative. Test flights in 1942 proved that the new Mustang could match or exceed any German fighter at high altitudes. Suddenly, the aircraft once dismissed as second-rate became a game-changer. A pilot who flew the modified Mustang later recalled that it was like putting a racehorse in place of a plow horse. Its range extended far beyond other fighters, and its speed allowed it to escort bombers deep into German territory. Back in the United States, industry mobilized. Factories at Inglewood and Dallas roared to life, while Packard Motor Car Company secured a license to produce the Merlin engine on American soil. Production figures soared. By the end of the war, more than 15,000 Mustangs had rolled off assembly lines. In the span of just a few years, the P-51 had gone from an unwanted experiment to the most feared escort fighter of the conflict. Its silhouette, long nose, bubble canopy, and graceful wings became a symbol of Allied dominance in the skies. But in 1941, none of this was certain. At that time, it was still the fighter without a future, overlooked by American commanders, underestimated by the Luftwaffe, and waiting for its chance to prove otherwise. The Mustang's unlikely transformation set the stage for one of the greatest reversals in air warfare. Soon, it would not only challenge German fighters over occupied Europe, but escort bombers all the way to Berlin, turning the Luftwaffe's confidence into desperation. By the summer of 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces were locked in a deadly gamble over the skies of Europe. American commanders clung to the doctrine of daylight precision bombing, convinced that carefully aimed strikes against factories, oil refineries, and ball-bearing plants would cripple Hitler's war machine. Unlike the British, who preferred night raids to minimize losses, the Americans believed technology, Norden bomb sights and tight formations of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 liberators would carry the day. But belief collided with brutal reality. Once bomber formations crossed deep into Germany, beyond the range of their P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning escorts, they were alone, slow, heavy, and exposed. The Luftwaffe's Jagdgeschwader squadrons, flying Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf FW 190s, waited like predators. The results were catastrophic. The raid on Regensburg and Schweinfurt in August 1943 became a grim turning point. Nearly 400 bombers set out. By the end of the day, 60 had been shot from the sky, and many more limped home, riddled with holes and trailing smoke. Survivors described the horror vividly. One crewman recalled watching an entire squadron disintegrate under cannon fire, B-17s spiraling downward, their fuel tanks exploding in fiery blossoms that lit the clouds. Another noted the dreadful silence when engines failed, followed only by the crackle of fire and the screams carried over intercoms before a plane vanished from formation. German pilots exuded confidence. To them, the skies above Bremen or Schweinfurt were hunting grounds. They struck in coordinated waves, firing rockets and 20mm cannons at close range before peeling away. For the Luftwaffe, it was proof that the Reich was still secure, that Fortress Europe was unbreakable. American losses mounted at unsustainable levels. In October, during the second Schweinfurt raid, 291 bombers left England. 60 never returned. Thousands of airmen were killed or captured in just a handful of missions. The idea that unescorted bombers could batter Germany into submission began to unravel. Even within the USAF, some whispered that daylight bombing was suicide. On the ground, German propaganda trumpeted each failed raid as evidence of American weakness. Radio Berlin mocked the flying coffins that dared challenge German skies. Families in Germany were reassured that the Reich's fighter arm was invincible. And for a time, it seemed true. The numbers told a bleak story. By the end of 1943, the 8th Air Force had lost a staggering percentage of its bomber crews. New recruits barely survived a few missions before being shot down. Morale dipped, and generals debated whether to scale back operations altogether. Yet despite the losses, the raids revealed a crucial truth. Germany's war machine was vulnerable, if the Allies could reach it. The factories at Schweinfurt, producing ball bearings essential for tanks and aircraft, were damaged but not destroyed. The Regensburg raid forced Messerschmitt production to scatter, but at terrible cost. The question was no longer whether the targets mattered, but whether the Americans could endure long enough to destroy them. For the men flying those missions, each sortie felt like a coin toss with death. Crews strapped into freezing gun positions at 25,000 feet, staring into a sky filled with contrails and incoming fighters. They relied on each other, their faith in the combat box, formation holding them together even as comrades vanished one by one. A gunner later wrote that every time he saw the silver flash of a German fighter's cannon, he wondered if the next second would be his last. By the close of 1943, the American bomber offensive teetered on the edge of collapse. Losses were so severe that some raids were canceled outright. The dream of breaking Germany through air power seemed destined to fail, unless something changed. That change was already waiting in the wings. A sleek fighter, once overlooked and even ridiculed, had been reborn with a new engine. Soon, the P-51 Mustang would enter the fight, and with it, the balance of the air war would tilt. The rebirth of the Mustang came not from America, but from Britain. By late 1942, the Royal Air Force was searching for a way to push its fighters higher and farther, into the realm where Germany's most critical industries lay. The North American P-51, sleek and fast at low altitude, had already been dismissed as a second-class machine when powered by the Allison V-1710 engine. It was quick close to the ground, effective in reconnaissance and ground attack, but gasped for breath above 15,000 feet, where the Luftwaffe ruled. It was the British who proposed the unlikely experiment. Fit the P-51 with their own Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that had given the Spitfire and Hurricane their edge in the Battle of Britain. The result was nothing short of revolutionary. The P-51, once mediocre at high altitude, was suddenly transformed into a predator. With the Merlin engine, it could climb faster, fight higher, and chase down the Luftwaffe's Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s on equal terms. Pilots immediately noticed the change. It was an airplane that wanted to fly, one later recalled. Where the old Allison Mustang struggled to keep pace, the Merlin Mustang seemed to leap skyward with ease. Its laminar flow wing design reduced drag, giving it remarkable efficiency at cruising speed. Coupled with the addition of drop tanks, the Mustang suddenly had legs long enough to reach Berlin and return. No other Allied fighter could make that claim in 1943. Armament added to its lethality. 6.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 3 in each wing, gave the Mustang devastating firepower. Capable of shredding fighters and even tearing apart bombers, its broad fields of fire meant few German aircraft could slip through unscathed. The Luftwaffe, accustomed to attacking bombers unchallenged once they outdistanced Allied escorts, was about to face a new reality. In American factories, production shifted rapidly. By early 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces had committed to the P-51 as their long-range solution. North American aviation's lines ran day and night, with thousands of Mustangs rolling off the assembly lines. At the Inglewood, California plant, workers, many of them women replacing men who had gone to war, fitted fuselages with wings, engines, and guns at astonishing speed. By the end of the war, more than 15,000 Mustangs would be produced, a testament to America's industrial might. German intelligence, however, remained skeptical. Reports of a new Allied fighter with unmatched range and high-altitude performance were dismissed as exaggerations. No Allied aircraft, they believed, could escort bombers all the way to the German capital. Luftwaffe aces continued to laugh at the thought, convinced that their Reich skies remained untouchable. But that laughter would fade. The first squadrons of Merlin-powered Mustangs began to arrive in Europe in late 1943. Pilots trained in England took to the skies with a fighter that, at last, could match the Luftwaffe on its own terms. As formations of B-17s and B-24s lifted off from English airfields for raids into the heart of Germany, P-51s began to form a protective shield around them. The effect was immediate. Luftwaffe pilots, diving in for their usual slaughter, suddenly found Mustangs on their tails at altitudes they had once owned. Climbing above 30,000 feet, dueling in icy contrails, the P-51s met them head-on. The hunters had become the hunted. By early 1944, the Mustang was no longer an experiment, but the very edge of Allied strategy. Its presence turned bomber missions from near-suicidal to survivable. Slowly, the tide of the air war shifted. German intelligence officers who once scoffed at reports of this miracle fighter now warned of disaster. The Reich skies were no longer a sanctuary. The Mustang, reborn through the marriage of American design and British engineering, had arrived, and with it, the hope of finally breaking Fortress Europe from above. The gamble had been made. In March 1944, for the first time in the war, America's long, lumbering bombers would not fly alone into the jaws of Germany's defenses. Lifting off from airfields across England, hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 liberators formed into massive combat boxes, contrails scarring the frigid sky. Their destination was the very heart of Hitler's Reich, Berlin itself. But this time, sleek shapes glided above and alongside them. The P-51 Mustang had arrived, and with it came a new chapter in the war in the air. Until this moment, Luftwaffe aces had treated American raids as opportunities. The bomber streams, brave as they were, had been easy prey once they passed beyond the range of their P-47 and Spitfire escorts. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s would dive into the formations, shredding them apart, their cannons blasting bombers from the sky. American losses were staggering. Missions to Schweinfurt and Regensburg had nearly broken the USAF's faith in daylight bombing. But on that cold March day in 1944, the balance shifted. When German pilots climbed to intercept, they expected the familiar sight of defenseless bombers. Instead, they found nimble fighters waiting for them. Mustangs dove like hawks, their 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns tearing into enemy formations. A Luftwaffe ace later admitted that the shock was profound. Suddenly, it was we who were hunted. The battles that followed were some of the fiercest of the entire air war. Over Berlin, the sky became a deadly ballet of twisting fighters and burning wreckage. Eyewitnesses described Mustang squadrons weaving above the bomber boxes, breaking apart German attacks before they could reach their targets. For American bomber crews, it was the first time they felt a sliver of hope. One airman recalled the relief of watching a Mustang dive past his B-17 to scatter incoming 109s. For once, it wasn't just us against the world. The effect on the Luftwaffe was devastating. Germany's air defense strategy had relied on its elite aces, men with hundreds of kills, symbols of Nazi resilience. But now, these veterans found themselves overwhelmed by swarms of determined Mustang pilots. Attrition mounted quickly. Each mission to Berlin cost Germany not only aircraft, but irreplaceable experience. Young replacements could not match the skill of the fallen aces, and the Mustang's relentless presence made survival ever more unlikely. On the ground, German civilians watched in horror as contrails filled the skies above their capital. The roar of engines was unending, punctuated by the distant thunder of bombs. To them, the war had arrived on their doorstep in a way propaganda could no longer conceal. The Reich, once invincible, was under siege from the air. For American commanders, the Berlin missions proved what they had long hoped, that precision daylight bombing, protected by long-range escort, could finally strike at the industrial and political core of Nazi Germany. The Mustangs had unlocked the skies. By the end of March, Luftwaffe leaders knew the tide had turned. Their pilots no longer dictated the battle. Every interception drained their strength, every engagement whittled away at their numbers. The hunters of 1940 and 1941 had become the prey of 1944. The sky over Berlin was no longer a German sky. It was a battlefield of attrition, and the Mustang ensured that it was one Germany could not win. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe's skies, was fighting for survival. Its ranks of seasoned aces had been thinned by relentless battles with the P-51 Mustang, while fuel shortages and Allied bombing of aircraft factories crippled its ability to recover. Into this weakening structure, the Mustang pressed its advantage with precision and ferocity. In the months before D-Day, Allied commanders understood that control of the air was non-negotiable. Without it, the invasion of Normandy would be suicide. The Mustangs, organized into long-range escort and fighter sweep missions, became the sharp edge of this effort. Day after day, they roared low over France and Germany, strafing airfields, locomotives, and convoys. German pilots often never made it off the ground. Eyewitness accounts from Allied pilots described fields littered with smoking aircraft. The Luftwaffe destroyed not in dogfights, but before its planes had left the runway. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the results of this campaign were undeniable. Allied bombers and transport planes crossed the channel in waves, delivering paratroopers and pummeling German defenses. Mustangs circled above, intercepting what few German fighters dared to rise. The Luftwaffe's response was scattered and ineffective. The once feared Jagdgeschwader squadrons could no longer mount concentrated strikes. A U.S. pilot later reflected, "The Luftwaffe was there, but it wasn't the Luftwaffe we had feared in '43. They were shadows." In the weeks that followed, as Allied armies pushed inland, the Mustang extended its dominance. Armed with bombs and rockets, it shifted seamlessly from escort fighter to ground attack machine, strafing retreating German columns, disrupting reinforcements, and making every daylight movement costly for the Wehrmacht. The Mustang's adaptability underscored its role as more than just a defender of bombers. It was a weapon of total aerial superiority. Yet the Luftwaffe was not finished. In desperation, it launched Operation Bodenplatte on January 1, 1945. Conceived as a surprise attack on Allied airfields in the Low Countries, it was meant to cripple the Allied air arm and give Germany breathing space during the Battle of the Bulge. At dawn, hundreds of German fighters swept across the frosty skies of Belgium and Holland, catching some units unprepared. But the element of surprise was fleeting. Mustangs and other Allied fighters scrambled quickly, rising to meet the attackers. The result was catastrophic for Germany. What began as a daring strike ended in disaster. Eyewitnesses recalled the sight of German fighters falling in flames across snow-covered fields. Allied accounts spoke of dogfights raging over airstrips, the air filled with burning debris. By the end of the day, the Luftwaffe had lost over 200 aircraft and, more critically, hundreds of irreplaceable pilots. A German officer later admitted that Bodenplatte broke the backbone of their air arm. It was the Luftwaffe's final gasp. From the hedgerows of Normandy to the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the P-51 Mustang had become an omnipresent force. Its pilots not only shielded bombers but also hunted the Luftwaffe into near extinction, crippling Germany's ability to contest the skies. By early 1945, the air war was effectively over. German fighters that once dominated Europe were now rare sights, their absence a silent testament to the relentless pressure of Allied air power. The Mustang had achieved what once seemed impossible. It had turned the skies of Europe from a German fortress into an Allied highway. Its contribution ensured that the invasion of Normandy succeeded, that Allied offensives pushed forward without fear of devastating air attack, and that Germany's war machine was left exposed to destruction from above. The Luftwaffe had gambled its future in the skies. Against the Mustang, it had lost. When the smoke cleared over Europe in 1945, the final tally told a story of transformation. The P-51 Mustang, once dismissed as an unimpressive prototype with an underpowered Allison engine, had risen to become the most feared Allied fighter of the war. In the European theater alone, Mustangs accounted for nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft destroyed. It was not just the number that mattered, but the caliber of the opponents. Luftwaffe aces, bomber destroyers, and the best of the Jagdwaffe fell to the Mustang's guns. The hunters had become the hunted, and Germany's vaunted air superiority had been broken. For Luftwaffe veterans, the memory was bitter. Pilots who once laughed at the Mustang in 1942 now admitted its decisive role in turning the tide. One German officer later reflected that, when the Mustangs came, the war in the air was lost. The P-51 robbed the Luftwaffe of its greatest strength, the ability to mass fighters against unescorted bombers. By 1944, every long-range raid into the Reich carried with it swarms of Mustangs, ready to pounce. Their presence drained the Luftwaffe of aircraft and, more critically, of its irreplaceable pool of experienced pilots. For American aircrews, the Mustang became more than a machine, it became salvation. Bomber crews who had once braced themselves for slaughter now watched gleaming P-51s slide into formation beside them, their sleek profiles cutting across the sky. Many remembered a wave of relief. The escorts had finally come all the way to Berlin. Pilots, too, formed a deep bond with the Mustang. They praised its agility, range, and forgiving design. One veteran recalled, "It felt like an airplane that wanted you to win." Beyond the battlefield, the Mustang's story symbolized the triumph of Allied industry and ingenuity. Born out of compromise, saved by the British Merlin engine, and mass-produced in American factories, the Mustang embodied the cooperation and adaptability that defined the Allied war effort. Each laminar flow wing, each six-gun burst, and each extended-range sortie testified to the power of engineering harnessed for survival. It was proof that the Allies could not only outproduce, but also out-innovate their enemy. Historians today argue that the Mustang's impact was decisive. Without it, the Allied strategic bombing campaign might have collapsed under unsustainable losses. Without secure skies, D-Day may have faced catastrophe. The liberation of Europe required not only soldiers on the beaches, but also dominance above them. And it was the Mustang that delivered it. In that sense, the aircraft's legacy stretches far beyond aerial dogfights. It is entwined with the very success of the Allied victory. For the men who flew it, the Mustang became a lasting symbol of freedom. To the Luftwaffe, it was the nightmare that ended their reign. And to history, it stands as one of the greatest fighters ever built, a machine once mocked that rose to legend. The closing irony is hard to ignore. Luftwaffe aces, certain of their superiority, had once dismissed the Mustang as nothing more than an underpowered curiosity. Yet it was the P-51 that escorted the bombers to Berlin, shattered the German air arm, and sealed the Reich's fate. From laughter to fear, from doubt to dominance, the legacy of the Mustang is the story of an aircraft that redefined the war in the skies, and with it, the future of air power. In the end, the conclusion is, in 1943, the skies over Europe belonged to the Luftwaffe. By 1945, contrails over Berlin told a different story, lines of Mustangs guarding the bombers, a symbol of Allied strength and German defeat. The fighter once laughed at became the blade that cut through the Reich's last defense. From mockery to legend, the P-51 Mustang soared not only as a machine of war, but as a promise of victory and the dawn of a new era in the skies.